Hello. Hello again. This is Andy Vining, reading another episode of My Mother's Diaries, kindly sponsored by Sienna Home Care. I'm enormously grateful for their continuing help as I work to share my mother's story with a wider audience. Sienna Home Care cared for my wife Val during her illness, and their kindness will always mean a great deal to me. I'd also like to thank Paul, who works tirelessly on the audio production every week and somehow manages to make my voice sound reasonable for you, my listening public. Thank you, Sienna Home Care, and to Paul for making My Mother's Diaries possible. And now we return to Hiltonbury Farm for November and December 1951. November began with the girls home from school for half term and Andrew due home from St Probus. The weather had become thoroughly miserable. Rain seemed to fall almost every day, leaving the farmyard muddy, the fields sodden, and the roads unpleasant for cycling. Even so, there was never any shortage of work. I began the month by having my hair permed, a very important part of my life, while John went to cattle sale with Norman. Later, while the rain held off, I walked with Joan along the gallop towards Butram Alley and the Camel's Hump. Back at home, I managed a little painting before returning to Jennifer's frock. Making clothes for 4 growing children takes a great deal of time, but it is always cheaper than buying them ready-made. There is always material to cut, a seam to stitch, or a hem to alter. The following day was Winnie Dean's birthday. It rained all morning, but I called in at the Deans and wished her a happy birthday. And while there, I bought a few early Christmas things before travelling to Salisbury to collect Andrew from school. It was always lovely to see him coming out from school with his belongings in his big tin trunk. However independent he was becoming, I still look forward to having him safely back at Hiltonbury for a while. That evening, John and Fred went to the Growball quiz at Lymington. Fair Oak unfortunately lost, although I am sure there was plenty of discussion afterwards about the questions that they should have answered correctly. On Saturday evening, John and I went to the Polygon with Wyn, Frank, George and Wyn's cousin Jean. We had a wonderful time. There was dancing, music and plenty of company, and for a few hours the rain and household jobs could be forgotten. Sunday was Auntie Bella's birthday, but it was another terrible day. But I managed to go to Beechcroft to see her, but found her very poorly in bed with a dreadful skin complaint. It was upsetting to see her so unwell, especially on her birthday. When I returned home, I lit the dining room fire and slept beside it for most of the evening. That fire became one of the comforts of that wet November. Once the curtains were drawn, the room felt warm and protected from the rain and the mud outside. And the next day brought still more rain. It was a rotten half-term holiday for Andrew, who had probably imagined spending his days outside on the farm, but it was not to be. Jennifer also had a cold and was home, and Julie Dean came to tea, which cheered Andrew up. They were very good friends and always enjoyed each other's company. John and I took Julie home later, and we stayed for a short while at the Deans and had a cup of tea. After finishing the ironing the following day, I took Mother, Andrew and Heather to May's in Southampton for afternoon tea and a little shopping. It was a real pleasant time together. Thankfully, it remained dry for Guy Fawkes night. The Deans, the Beatons, the Parkers, the Inges, Bet and Fred, and it seemed like the whole world came to Hiltonbury for fireworks and a huge bonfire. The children had a wonderful time. There were sparklers, rockets and all the usual fun, with hot sausages, bacon and lovely bread rolls with hot soup supper to follow. The bangs echoed across the farm, and even the animals must have wondered what was happening. Far too soon it was time to take Andrew back to St Probus. Then, after leaving him at school, back at home, I planted some plants and tulip bulbs before continuing my alterations to Heather's skirt. John and I took a calf to Romsey Market before going to the village, and later I cycled to Jones for tea, and I finally finished Heather's skirt. Taking bull calves to market is part of the regular farm business. They are carried in a sack in the back of the car and could sometimes become rather smelly during the journey. At the market, they were left to be sold, and that was always a little sad. The following day, rain poured down from the morning until night. I spent the afternoon and evening working on Jennifer's frock now, while John travelled to Devizes with Norman for a Jersey cattle meeting, and he returned very late. Probably a visit to the pub might have ended the evening, I suspect. Building the Hiltonbury's pedigree Jersey herd was always at the forefront of John's mind. There were meetings, sales, and careful breeding decisions with endless discussions about bloodlines, milk production, and the ancestry of particular cows. Sunday was Mother's birthday. John went to Hursley Lodge, so Fred picked me up from the farm and took me for an evening at Beechcroft, but poor Auntie Bella was still very ill. The following Sunday, the Hiltonbury kitchen was filled with men. Mr. Fry arrived with a very nice new wireless set for me, and Freddie Freeborn, our contractor friend, Mr. Cross, Den Guppy, all came in as well, and before long everyone was settled around the kitchen table with cups of tea. These Sunday gatherings often became unofficial farm meetings. Machinery, cattle, football, and the village news were all discussed, and nobody appeared to be in any hurry to leave. Monday was rotten again, so I lit the dining room fire and I slept in front of it for much of the evening. Perhaps I was simply exhausted, because between the children, animals, sewing, painting, washing, and visitors, there was rarely a completely quiet day. When the weather improved, I walked to the hall for dancing practice, and John collected me afterwards and brought me back home. Then Les and Joan Beaton came round that evening, and Mr. Cross called in as well. Then we had a lovely day. Following me finishing painting the dining room windows at last, Bet and Fred came over in the evening, either to admire the results or simply to enjoy another cup of tea. There was important livestock business the following day. John travelled to Reading with Norman and returned having bought a beautiful new bull. The bull's breeding would influence future generations of the herd, so they would have studied his pedigree and appearance very carefully. A bull also had to be treated with respect. Even a normally quiet animal can be powerful and unpredictable at times. So while John dealt with this new arrival, I continued sewing Jennifer's frock. By Friday evening, I was ready for a quieter day. I went to the village, Joan came to tea, and I spent the evening knitting and reading. Saturday was showery, but John went to football as usual, and that evening I went to the Grand Theatre to see a comedy called Room for Two. Set in Venice, it involved an unfaithful husband, a determined admirer, and Vic Oliver disguising himself as a lady's maid, with predictably complicated results. It was jolly funny and made a welcome change from the gloomy weather. The rain was dreadful again on Sunday, and the poor hens were in a terrible state. Their runs were muddy, their houses were difficult to keep clean, and the birds looked thoroughly bedraggled. We had a new chicken unit built in September, but even the good house could not completely protect them from weeks of wet weather. The following day was Tommy Parker's birthday, so we went to the Parker's house in Pine Road, next door to the Beatons, for supper. Monday brought another terrible day, but John and I took a heifer calf to Norman's, and unfortunately I had to dry all the washing in the kitchen because there was no hope of hanging it outside. Wet clothes filled the room while the fire struggled to dry them. John drove me into Southampton to buy shoes for Jennifer, and that evening he attended a dinner at Murden Lodge while I ironed and listened to a radio play. The next day was a little better. The tea man called, and I bought some night dresses from him. Travelling salesmen are a regular part of country life, and I particularly liked the tea man. He was such a pleasant fellow, and his suitcase and van were always filled with interesting things. With Hiltonbury some distance from the shops, having goods bought directly to the door is extremely convenient for me. I went to the hall for dancing, and later Wynne and I caught the bus into Southampton, where we met Mother and the girls from school. We all went to see An American in Paris, the new Technicolor musical starring Gene Kelly and Leslie Caron. It told the story of an American painter living in Paris who falls in love with a young French woman, leading to a romance and misunderstandings, accompanied by a wonderful dancing and the music of George Gershwin. The next day was rent day, so I returned into Southampton with John, who had the business to discuss at Weeks and Greens, their accountants. We left Heather and with Wynne, and when we returned we had lunch with her and Frank at the Deans. That evening the Beatons, the Buckets and Deans all came to supper. We had a lovely evening, it was great fun. But by late November thoughts were turning properly towards Christmas. I had my hair done, met Joan and Lorna, and later Joan and Les walked up to Hiltonbury and stayed for tea. Then I began making the Christmas puddings. Fruit to weigh, ingredients to mix, basins to grease and cover. Everyone has a stir and made a wish. And the following day I boiled the puddings for hours. Steam filled the kitchen, the windows dripped with condensation, and the water had to be topped up regularly to stop the pans from boiling dry. That evening, John and I went to the Romsey Golf Club dance at the Polygon with the Buckets, the Deans and the Dobles. It had been a misty, wet day, but the dance was jolly good. Saturday was horrible again, filthy weather. But the usual visitors called, and I spent part of the afternoon mending sheets. John had developed a horrible cold, and he went to bed early. On Sunday, the familiar collection of men gathered in the kitchen again, Mr. Cross, Den Guppy, Fred, Mr. Fry. It was becoming something of a weekly event. And despite the weather, I managed to plant 12 new rose trees in the garden. Den and Mr. Cross then helped move some of the hens out of the wet plot and stayed for tea. Moving hens is never quite as simple as it sounds. There was always one bird determined to escape, flap over someone's shoulders or run back towards the house it had just left. They were a bit pesky, but we managed. And that evening I settled beside the dining room fire with my knitting and a book. The following day the weather changed. It was lovely. I ironed in the afternoon, enjoyed another peaceful evening reading, knitting and listening to the wireless. And so November ended quietly. I continued teaching dancing at the hall, while John attended an emulation lodge meeting in Hursley. Joan called, I walked to see Mother, and Crossy arrived one evening carrying flowers for me, which was a really kind surprise of him. I had also begun making Heather a kilt, and on Friday evening of November we had an early tea, and we left Hiltonbury at 6 o'clock for Andrew's school concert. Wynne, Julie, Bet and Fred all came with us with the girls. The concert was very good, and I was proud to see Andrew taking part. As it was a boys' school, someone has to play the female's role, and that someone was Andrew, appearing as Princess Marina in a short drama. The boys had rehearsed for weeks, looked very smart and put on a splendid show. It was a lovely way to end the month. And so we move into December, and that began with the usual Saturday visitors. During the week I went to another Growball Club quiz with Bet and Fred. We lost by 4 points and stopped to see Nora for half an hour on the way home. Sunday was pleasant. I washed the kitchen curtains, lit the dining room fire, and spent the evening again quietly reading and snoozing. Janet was home from school the following day with a terrible cold, and the weather was dreadful again. It just keeps getting worse. And once more I had to dry all the washing in the kitchen. Then came a very difficult day. Our old cowman had resigned some time earlier, but would not leave the Thai cottage he was living in. So John had to spend a whole day at court, and the decision went in our favour. The cowman was ordered to leave the cottage within 6 weeks. The cottage came with his work and was now needed for his replacement. It's an unpleasant situation, but Fred had understood the arrangements when he took the job. It was a shame that court action had been necessary to remove him. The following day I made Christmas cakes. Betty walked up with Timothy and stayed while I stirred the mixture. We both made wishes as we stirred. That evening I went to the pictures with the Deans, and the next day Mother and I spent the whole day Christmas shopping in Southampton. I bought new pyjamas for Janet and a riding jacket for Jennifer. Jennifer's love of horses was becoming an important part of her life, and the jacket was something she could wear proudly at the pony club events, gymkhanas and meets that she would go to. The following morning was so busy that I had no time to visit the village. Joan came up during the afternoon, and later we went to the Beatons for some fish and chips. They were really lovely. Saturday brought rain and strong winds. Joan and Les called again, while Frank and John went to Hursley Lodge. Janet attended Rosemary's party, having gone over her cold, and Wynne and Julie came for the evening. The weather improved a little the next day, allowing me to get the washing dry at least. Mr. Cross and Den Guppy called. I lit the dining room fire and spent most of the evening wrapping Christmas presents. The pile of parcels was gradually growing. Each one has to be wrapped, labelled and hidden from curious children. Monday remained fine. I ironed throughout the afternoon. Bet and Fred came round in the evening, and I found time for a little knitting. Then, that night, there was a very hard frost. The next day I went to the hall for dancing, and Fred met me afterwards and brought me home. Janet came home for lunch before returning to school for a party, while I wrapped more presents. The cold weather continued, and no rain. I went to shopping in Winchester with the Deans, and I packed Andrew's weekly school parcel. It contained his usual fruit cake and other useful things, all carefully wrapped to survive the postal journey, but I know he looked forward to those parcels at school. After visiting the hairdresser, I spent another evening packing presents and was nearly finished. John attempted to drive to an NFU meeting that evening, but had to turn back and came home because the fog was too thick to see his way through. Country roads are difficult enough after dark, but heavy fog made them almost impossible. There are few road markings and no streetlights to guide the way. I went shopping with Bet the following morning. John attended an AEC meeting, and that evening we went to the Buckets, to the Young Farmers' Ball in Winchester. It was great fun. The following day brought the usual visitors, and John went to football. Janet attended another party, and Jennifer went shopping. Nora telephoned to say that George had chickenpox, so we have to keep clear of him, and I spent a lovely evening again asleep in front of the dining room fire. I seem to be doing a lot of that lately. Sunday brought a rather important event in the dogs' lives. Lassie was mated with Laddie, the young gentleman from Badsley Road. We have to wait now and see whether puppies arrive in the new year. Lassie belongs to the Thompsons, who live over there, and we do keep them as really good friends. John, Mr. Cross and Den went round to Mother's to help cut down some trees in the garden at Beechcroft, and I stayed home and listened to White Oaks on the radio. It was a BBC play about the quarrelsome White Oak family and their Canadian estate, Jalna. At the centre of the story was the formidable elderly grandmother, Adeline, and the turmoil caused when she left her fortune to Finch, a sensitive young musician of the family. Anyway, it was good fun to listen to. Then Guppy came to tea, and later I went to the sanatorium to practice Christmas carols before calling at the Dean's. Singing to the patients seems especially important, as many of them will be away from their homes with TB, and they will be missing their families at Christmas. The following day brought excellent news from the chicken houses. After we'd moved them after all the rain, Joan came to help wash the eggs, and we collected an extraordinary total of 128. All the eggs have to be cleaned, inspected and packed before being taken to the packing station in Pine Road. And after the rain and the poor condition of the hens in November, it was encouraged to seeing the young pullets laying so well now. John went to football at the Dell that evening, while I stayed home and did the ironing. Then on Tuesday, John and I collected Andrew from St Probus home for Christmas holidays. We met the new headmaster, Mr. French, and his lovely wife, Elizabeth. The former headmaster, Dr. Moore, had left in unfortunate circumstances. We discovered that he'd been working under an assumed name and was really called Montague Black. Thankfully, none of this had affected Andrew. He was simply delighted to see us and excited about coming home for Christmas. Back at Hiltonbury, preparations took a very practical turn. John had obtained a mechanical plucker for the Christmas cockerels, and we plucked up the first 30 birds. They'd been raised throughout the year for the Christmas trade, and the machine saved a great deal of time. But every bird still had to be handled individually. Bet spent the whole day helping me draw and truss the birds. Drawing meant removing the innards and cleaning each bird thoroughly. Trussing involved tying it neatly, ready for sale. It was tiring and messy work, and by the end of the day our hands must have been sore and the kitchen in need of thorough cleaning. Joan called in during the afternoon and helped with a few, as I taught her how to draw a chicken earlier in the year. I had also, for some reason, agreed to help at the sanatorium with its Christmas celebrations, although I don't know where I'll find the time. But, unfortunately, I developed a rotten throat and I completely lost my voice. Even so, I went shopping with Joan, Les and Lorna, and later Joan and Les came up to help prepare even more chickens for the Christmas business. John, Les, Frank and Tom all went to Frank's lodge, while I spent the evening at Joan's. My cold was somewhat better the following day. I completed various jobs, wrote the Christmas cards, and was once again joined by Joan and Les, who helped draw even more chickens. Friends and neighbours helped one another without much fuss, whether it was moving hens, preparing chickens, cutting down trees or gathering crops. Someone was usually willing to lend us a hand. On Sunday, John went to football while I prepared for another evening out. We went to the cricket club dance at Eastleigh in the evening, where I met Charlie Knott and his wife, a very nice couple. And afterwards we continued to Joy Doble's party. The following day was pretty hectic. I did some cooking while Den and Crossy called during the afternoon. John and children went to the carol service at the sanatorium, but my throat remained too painful, so I stayed at home. Christmas Eve arrived with rain and gales. The kitchen fire was smoking, which was the last thing I needed on one of the busiest days of the year. There was food to prepare, presents to arrange, and children to organise, and somehow I still managed to have my hair done during the afternoon, very important part of my life, as I've said before. After tea, I popped round to Beechcroft. Joan, Les and the Deans came to Hiltonbury, and we enjoyed a lovely evening. The wind must have been howling outside, but the farmhouse was warm and filled with voices. Christmas Day began with church at St Boniface. We called at the Dean's for half an hour afterwards, and later I took the children to Anfield Church. In the evening we went to Beechcroft, where the Miller family had gathered, and it was a really, really nice Christmas day. After all the shopping, cooking, puddings, cakes, chickens, parcels and preparation, Christmas itself passed peacefully among family and friends. On Boxing Day, we went into Romsey to the square to the Hursley Hunt meet. Jennifer rode Smoky over there and looked very smart in her new riding jacket. The horses, riders and hounds made an impressive sight as everyone gathered in the winter air. John, later, went to football at the Dell again to see Southampton play. And that evening, Mother, Bet, Fred and the Deans all came to Hiltonbury. The following day, John's birthday, we left at 12:20 for the pantomime in Bournemouth. We travelled in our car while the Deans followed in theirs. It was a lovely day. We had tea at the pavilion and finished the evening at the Deans for supper after the wonderful pantomime. And after the excitement of that pantomime, I spent most of Friday trying to tidy the house. Unfortunately, the weather had turned terrible again, with wind and rain. But Julie Dean came to tea, and I went to bed early. Saturday was a little better. John went to football again, while Den took the children to the circus. Jennifer was allowed to ride one of the circus horses, and she won 2 shillings and 6pence, half a crown, as we call it. She must have been delighted. Riding the circus horse was exciting enough, but winning that money made it even better for her. Joan and Les came round for the evening, and Mary Sinclair telephoned. And then the final Sunday of the year was quite pleasant. Fred and Vi called on their way home from Wittering, where they'd been for Christmas. Stanley came in for a drink during the evening, and Bill Sinclair also telephoned. Then came some sad news. Mrs. Watson in Cantley had died. We promised to look after young Jim for a few days, and on New Year's Eve, Bill brought him to Hiltonbury at about 8:30. I managed to finish the ironing, and once Jim was settled in, John and I went with the gang to the New Year's Eve ball. It was jolly good. And so 1951 came to an end. The year had brought all the ordinary joys and worries of life at Hiltonbury. Calves had been born, cattle brought, hay cut and oats thrashed. We had lost poor Emblem in the summer, but welcomed other calves into the herd. The young pullets had become productive hens, ending the year with a remarkable total of 128 eggs in a single day. There had been school terms, sports days, dancing displays, cricket matches, shows and children's parties. Jennifer had written a pony club camp, appeared proudly on Smoky, and even won half a crown at the circus. Andrew had worked hard at St Probus, topped his form, and ended the year by appearing as Princess Marina in the school concert. Heather was growing up fast, and there had been visits to the Festival of Britain, the Isle of Wight, the Diaries show, and the theatre. Norman had won the Buckhurst Trophy, providing one of the proudest moments of the farming year. There had been endless rain, washing dried in the kitchen, muddy hens, coughs, colds, and sad news amongst our friends and family. There was nearly always someone calling at the door. There was usually room for another person at the table, and another tea in the pot for one more cup. And as midnight approached on New Year's Eve, we danced with our friends and prepared to welcome 1952. At Hiltonbury, the cows would still need milking, the hens would continue laying, and the children, Jennifer, Janet, Andrew and Heather, would all soon return to school. But for one evening we could all put the work aside, enjoy the music and celebrate the evening of another busy year together. Thank you for listening to my mother's diaries.